We typically think of human behavior as being driven by a pretty simple pursuit of pleasure. We do things because they feel good, right? It just makes sense. But when we actually look at the neuroscience of compulsive behaviors and substance use, that intuitive, everyday logic, it completely falls apart. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dive straight into a really profound mystery: how the human brain's reward system can literally be hijacked, completely overriding our most basic, hardwired survival drives.
So, right off the bat, we're faced with the ultimate paradox. Why in the world do people chronically relapse and obsessively seek out a substance, even when it yields absolutely zero pleasure? It's kind of the central puzzle when it comes to understanding addiction. I mean, even when a person logically knows that taking a drug won't bring them any joy and will probably just lead to more misery, the urge is still overwhelmingly powerful. So how exactly can a behavior remain so compulsive if the actual reward is gone?
Well, for the longest time, the scientific community just assumed that wanting something and liking something were essentially the exact same thing, just two sides of the same coin. But an astonishing clinical observation completely shattered that assumption. Researchers Mike Robinson and Kent Burridge highlighted this staggering disconnect that addicts often experience. They found that people would desperately, intensely want a drug that they actively reported disliking.
And that specific observation is what brings us to the scientific framework that actually solves this entire biological mystery. It's called the incentive sensitization theory. Proposed back in 1993, this theory was an absolute game changer. It revolutionized our understanding of the brain for a general science audience by doing something pretty radical. It partitioned the concept of reward into two entirely distinct psychological buckets: wanting and liking. The theory basically suggests that addictive substances create these long-lasting physical changes in the brain that selectively amplify the wanting mechanism while leaving the liking mechanism completely flat.
Okay, moving into section 1, wanting versus liking. Let's look at this biological divorce of desire and pleasure.
Now, in a healthy brain, these two systems work in perfect, seamless harmony. You like the taste of a good meal, so naturally you want to eat it. But it turns out they are wired into entirely different neural circuits. Wanting, which neuroscientists call incentive salience, is driven by the mesolimbic dopamine system. That is your engine of craving. Liking, on the other hand, is the actual pleasure you feel, and that's mediated by completely separate, much smaller circuits known as hedonic hotspots, specifically the opiate GABA system. So dopamine isn't actually the pleasure molecule we all thought it was for decades. It's strictly the motivation molecule. And addictive substances just happen to have this unique, devastating ability to drive a massive wedge right between these two systems.
Which brings us to a really harsh biological reality. Over time, the brain builds tolerance to the actual pleasure of a drug. That liking system adapts, meaning the euphoria you get physically diminishes. But here is the cruel biological trap. The dopamine wanting system does the exact opposite. It becomes sensitized. Those neural pathways become hyper-reactive. So with repeated exposure, the physical craving just grows stronger and stronger, even as the actual pleasure fades entirely away. You are literally left with a pathological level of desire, with absolutely zero payoff.
Let's jump into section 2, hijacking the reward system and how this process overrides our natural survival drives.
You have to remember, our reward circuitry evolved over millions of years to literally keep us alive. It's supposed to reward us for effort. Things like tracking down calorie-dense food or building social connections. And in return for that hard work, your brain gives you a normal, nicely regulated dose of dopamine. But alcohol and drugs, they don't play by those evolutionary rules at all. They act as a biological shortcut. They suppress the brain's internal braking system, the GABA system, and flood your brain with massive, completely unnatural dopamine surges. You're getting the ultimate chemical reward without having achieved a single thing that actually aids your survival.
So what happens next? Well, because the brain is constantly overwhelmed by these artificial dopamine spikes, it panics and tries to restore balance. It compensates by turning down its own factory, producing way less of its own baseline dopamine, and the result is devastating. Suddenly, natural rewards, like enjoying a good meal or hanging out with friends, they feel completely dull. The substance goes from being something that feels good to something that feels absolutely essential just to function on a basic level. The cravings aren't merely psychological anymore. They are profound, biological needs driven by a brain operating in a severe dopamine deficit.
All right, section 3, cues as motivational magnets and how our brain anticipates the reward.
Because we obviously don't consume these substances in a vacuum, the brain, which is an absolute master at associative learning, starts connecting environmental details to those massive dopamine hits. It builds a predictable loop, a cue, a routine,
and a reward. But because of that sensitization we talked about earlier, something incredible happens. The brain eventually starts releasing dopamine in response to the cue alone. Think about it. If you always have a drink right after work, just walking out of your office doors triggers a massive dopamine surge of anticipation. The craving hits with full force before a single drop of alcohol is even consumed.
Neuroscientists call these cues motivational magnets. Because the wanting system has become so incredibly hypersensitive, totally ordinary things, a specific bar, a certain glass, a time of day, are suddenly imbued with this irresistible pull. They trigger such overwhelming automatic desires that taking the substance is hardly even a conscious choice anymore. And this perfectly explains highly irrational behaviors you might see, like an addict frantically searching the carpet for a speck of a drug that is obviously just a piece of lint. It's a phenomenon known as chasing ghosts. The cue itself has literally become the focal point of the craving.
Which brings us to Section 4, the cycle of addiction. Let's look at the actual lived experience of this biological hijacking.
When we pull back and look at all this science together, we see this relentless three-stage loop playing out directly across compromised regions of the brain. First, you have the binge and intoxication stage, where the basal ganglia reinforces the habit. Then the withdrawal stage, centered right there in the extended amygdala, where the brain severely suffers the absence of the drug. And finally, the anticipation stage, governed by a physically compromised prefrontal cortex, which leads you right back to overwhelming cravings and restarts the entire vicious cycle all over again.
Now, it is absolutely vital to understand a very specific state tied to that withdrawal stage. It's called hypercataphasia. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it describes the profoundly overactive, intensely negative emotional state that happens when the substance is removed. During this stage, the individual is no longer using to achieve a high. Not at all. Instead, they are desperately trying to escape an agonizing emotional low caused by their heavily damaged stress and reward systems. They are, quite simply, self-medicating their own withdrawal.
So the really crucial takeaway from all of this is that addiction isn't a moral failing. It's not simply a lack of willpower. It is a profound physical alteration of brain chemistry. Those environmental cues are triggering entirely unconscious biological urges. The dopamine system is screaming for balance. And at the exact same time, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's actually responsible for logical decision-making and exercising restraint, is physically compromised from chronic use. You are essentially asking a broken brake pedal to stop a runaway train. It's just not going to work.
Understanding the true mechanics of the brain completely reframes everything we thought we knew about compulsive behaviors. If wanting and liking are biologically separated and our very survival systems are being hijacked, we absolutely have to move beyond the stigma. So I'll leave you with this. How does understanding incentive sensitization fundamentally change the way we view those struggling? And how must it change the way we design our medical treatments and therapies going forward? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer to explore such a counterintuitive yet fascinating biological mystery. See you next time.